So in my previous episode, we discussed about the Microsoft Hybrid Cloud umbrella, which consists of the Azure Stack Hub, Azure Stack HCI, and Azure Stack Edge. With Azure Stack Hub, customers are able to bring Azure consistent services to on-premises, while Azure Stack HCI can help customers modernize their aging three-tier SAN architecture into more advanced hyper-converged infrastructure using the storage spaces direct technology from Microsoft. And with Azure Stack Edge, customers will be able to do image inferencing or video inferencing kind of use cases, also process their IoT data and transfer the edge location data back into public Azure. So in this episode, we're going to look at and probably dive a little deeper into what Azure Stack HCI is all about. Hello everyone and welcome back. I know it's been a long pause, close to about 2 months. I have my own reasons to complain about, but the good news is I finally found some time to contribute some more episodes into my YouTube channel, Giant on Cloud. Once again, a very warm welcome to all of you to my YouTube channel, Giant on Cloud. Please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified as and when I upload new videos. And also, don't forget to leave your comments and feedback and let me know what you think about this new episode. All right, so while we look at the Azure Stack HCI overview, but let's also dive a little deeper to understand why does the industry really have to care about HCI market in general. Now, the server growth stands at 12% in Q1, the calendar year 2021. And IDC predictions are that by 2026, the global hyperconverged infrastructure market is expected to witness 26.1% growth. That's a phenomenal number. If you just look at the overall market size, HCI is expected to grow from anywhere between 25 billion US dollars to $31.36 billion. Think about it, right? There's a huge potential opportunity for everybody out there to go and capture this HCI market, and obviously Microsoft definitely doesn't want to be lagging behind in this space. So from a Microsoft standpoint, HCI market for them has witnessed pretty significant growth, 9% year on year, and it's expected to be $13.5 billion by 2023. So as you can see, there's a lot of potential for everybody to go and capture this market. Now, if you think about Azure Stack HCI in general, I talk to a number of customers within the region that I operate from, which is Asia Pacific, and a lot of customers tell me, hey Jain, whatever that you tell me about Azure Stack HCI capabilities sounds musical, sounds really great, phenomenal product, no doubt. But my apprehensions are it is fairly new to the market. Well, the answer is it's not really the truth. The underlying components of the Azure Stack HCI existed way back in 2016, which was known as the Windows Storage Spaces Direct, formerly known as officially known as WSSD. So this existed way back in 2016. Even from a Dell standpoint, we actually had probably one of the first OEMs to actually partner with Microsoft to develop hyperconverged infrastructure which could work on WSSD. So to a lot of customers today and people who are really apprehensive of the industry in general about Azure Stack HCI is fairly new? Not really. In fact, Azure Stack HCI is really seasoned product today as it stands. I mean, close to about 6 years of legacy already, right? Considering how new HCI space in general. So I think Microsoft has been there. Over the years, you will see how the Windows Storage Spaces Direct has been, evolved over the period of time to take into the Azure Stack HCI shape that is in today. So if you look at the Microsoft ecosystem for Azure Stack HCI, now Azure Stack HCI can be deployed in a different approach altogether, right? There are ways that you can go deploy Azure Stack HCI operating system while customers go on to modernize their aging 3-tier SAN. One of the options is do-it-yourself approach, which means organizations and customers are solely and wholly responsible for pretty much gathering the hardware that is required to bring up the Azure Stack HCI cluster, which means they're responsible pretty much from a certification standpoint to acquiring the right components to ensure the Azure Stack HCI works on those hardware components. So they're completely responsible for bringing that cluster, up and running so that it's ready for day one to day in operation. The other approach the industry is adopting is the validated node approach. If you look at the number of hardware OEM partners which Microsoft has certified, so they have a stream of the bare metal servers, which they call. So these bare metal servers are not only just being validated on Azure Stack HCI, but they've also been validated on a number of other operating systems as well. So it is the same platform which is qualified now to run Azure Stack HCI as well, in which case the OEM is kind of responsible to ensure the overall compatibility and stuff. But then that just comes to the validation only, right? It doesn't mean that the OEM is completely responsible for the cluster stack in general. Now this is where the integrated system really shines. Now integrated system approach means that you're pretty much stitching the system or stitching the entire solution as a true engineered turnkey solution, which means the hardware OEM manufacturer is wholly and solely responsible to carry through all kinds of engineering efforts that is potentially needed to validate this entire solution, not just validation perspective, but also right from the process of ordering to deployment to maintenance to support. So you pretty much have completely the OEM and Microsoft, because this is where Microsoft and the hardware OEM can jointly engineer together to actually build an integrated platform. So all the engineering efforts you're kind of offloading to Microsoft and the OEM hardware partner, so that you as a customer does not really have to spend time to stitching the solution together. That saves a significant amount of time. Think about it, right? As organizations today are slowly getting rid of the business of IT, they don't want to be stitching the components together and spending awful amount of time just validating these solutions or just validating these components so that they can work for Azure Stack HCI. Not really, right? So this is where the turnkey solutions using the integrated system approach can be huge value for many customers, because it saves a lot of time for customers to bring up that cluster and get them ready for day one to day end operation of their cluster, so that they can eventually focus on their business goals. So that brings us to the question, what is Azure Stack HCI? Now, according to Microsoft definition, Azure Stack HCI is a purpose-built HCI operating system which is delivered as an Azure service. So what do you mean delivered as an Azure service? Now, if you're familiar with Azure, if you go to portal.azure.com, you can look up, there are a number of Azure services. Today, Azure has probably more than 100 plus services. If you look up the number of services there, Azure Stack HCI is also one of the services. So which means when I say, or when Microsoft says, Azure Stack HCI is a purpose-built HCI operating system delivered as an Azure service, they literally mean this, because it's one of the services which is delivered into customers' data centers. So when I probably do a live demo of how this actually integrates the on-premises Azure Stack HCI cluster integrates with public Azure, probably you'll get a better idea about how these two are really literally married together using the Azure Stack HCI service. So, like I discussed in the previous previous slide, right? Azure Stack HCI is not really new. It has been there. It's evolution of the WSSD, right? We pretty much are are very familiar with the Hyper-V. It's existed a long time back. The storage spaces direct, which is also known as the WSSD way back in 2016, right? And the software-defined networking and the software-defined compute. So all of this is actually truly integrated into Azure Stack HCI. It's just that the name, it's been rebranded. The WSSD has been rebranded as Azure Stack HCI. So it carries the same legacy, seasoned software-defined components like Hyper-V, SDN, and storage spaces direct to literally do the hyperconverged infrastructure what it is today. So the only difference is today the Azure Stack HCI is Azure inspired. It's a Azure inspired software-defined overall software-defined data center in general, right? So one of the things that Microsoft is trying to paint this picture, this is something that I keep listening to Satya Nadella in pretty much most of his talk shows, where he literally talks about the ubiquitous computing, because it's computing anywhere, but the real challenge is for everybody to solve is how do you stitch this distributed computing ecosystem to operate from a single pane of glass, really single pane of glass. So this is where Microsoft has spent a lot of engineering efforts to making this a truly hybrid by design, which means, like we talked about, there are a number of reasons today why customers want to host their applications and data on premises to meet their regulatory needs. Not everything can be just simply ported to public clouds. So the challenges that bring in this kind of situations is how do you really manage this distributed ecosystem. So this is where Microsoft has done probably spent a lot of their engineering efforts to help customers to manage this infrastructure right from a single pane of glass. So Azure Stack HCI is a no-brainer. It's hybrid by design. Remember, it is delivered as an Azure service. So it is hybrid by design, which means you should be able to pretty much manage and monitor your Azure Stack HCI clusters right from an Azure control plane. So we're going to see that when we actually dive right into the demo after a while. The other thing is, so many customers may be apprehensive about, well, you're trying to build a solution which is focused mostly towards public Azure, but I don't really have the skill sets to manage and manage this infrastructure, which is the Azure Stack HCI cluster on premises. Not really. So it actually gives customers the best of both worlds, which means you can still rely on your legacy tooling, that is like PowerShells or the Windows Admin Center, which is the de facto tool to manage and monitor your Azure Stack HCI clusters. So all your System Center suite of products, which you're already familiar, while you're managing your Hyper-V ecosystem, even from a 3-tier SAN perspective. So you pretty much have the same legacy tools that you can use to manage your cluster on premises. But if you are also comfortable with public Azure, you can also leverage public Azure skill sets to manage the on-premises Azure Stack HCI clusters as well. So it literally brings the best of both worlds in terms of IT skills for customers to manage on-premises and also to manage from an Azure control plane. So this brings us to a very interesting debate. In fact, I'm planning to have a separate episode for this, where I will be comparing the differences between the Azure Stack HCI versus the Windows Server. If you think about it, right from this episode perspective, I'm going to just quickly cover this at a very, very high level. Now, what is the difference between Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI? Technically, there is no difference. It's both are same. right? The way it is targeted, the use cases may vary, right? So this is where Azure Stack HCI and Windows Server shines in their own perspective. So we will probably spend a lot of time talking about Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI. For the interest of this episode, please keep in mind that there are two distinct products to deal with. One is the Windows Server and the other one is Azure Stack HCI. And depending on the customer's use case, you can probably position the right server. So end of the day, both of them do the same, implement the software-defined data center components that we are familiar with. Windows Server like Hyper-V, Storage Spaces Direct, and software-defined networking. Both of them implement all these technologies, but the use cases in terms of using Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI may differ. Like I said, we will have a separate episode talking about Windows Server, comparing Windows Server versus Azure Stack HCI. Now, if you look at the Azure Stack HCI architecture in general, right? So underlying hardware, it's the Microsoft has certified a number of hardware OEM partners, where Dell is one of the predominant partners in that space. So you have that completely integrated system. So one of the things to note here is Dell is probably the only hardware partner or the hardware OEM today to go with the fully integrated system approach. In fact, this is what is recommended by Microsoft as well. While others in the industry still follow a combination of integrated and validated approach, but from a Dell standpoint, we completely are heavily focused on integrated system approach. Now you have the underlying hardware system. In our case, it's called the AX node, which are purpose built. So these are not bare metal servers, which are like, for example, if you're familiar with the PowerEdge series, although the architecture is same, but the product is specifically designed for Azure Stack HCI only. So this is where, when we say integrated approach, this means right from a product standpoint to overall life cycle of the product, we really mean that there's a dedicated hardware which is specifically meant to and designed to work on Azure Stack HCI. So the underlying infrastructure is Azure Stack HCI. So we will probably in my subsequent episodes, we will probably delve a little deeper into how Storage Spaces Direct, software-defined networking, and Hyper-V abstracts the underlying infrastructure and builds that automation on top of that, right? That's the huge value of HCI today. So different HCI vendors implement their own logic in terms of how they implement software-defined logic into their HCI infrastructure. But we are going to take a separate episode. We'll look at how probably delve a little deeper to understand how Microsoft implements this from a software-defined angle. So you have the Azure Stack HCI, after the hardware infrastructure, you have the Azure Stack HCI operating system sitting on top of it, and using which you can still, customers today who are traditionally develop any applications to run on a virtualized environment, they can spin up their own virtual machines. Either it could be a Windows virtual machine or a Linux virtual machine, or the customers are comfortable today. So today, it's all about modernization. If customers don't modernize their application, they are going to be left behind, and every industry knows that. Because if they don't modernize, their competitors are modernizing, right? So this puts them in a tight spot where every industry today does not have an option but to modernize their applications, which are from a legacy traditional application to a much more modernized containers and so on and so forth. The beauty is the Azure Stack HCI brings the best of both worlds, which means you can lift and shift your legacy virtualized applications onto a more advanced hyper-converged infrastructure, where you're not only just modernizing your infrastructure, but it also gives you a wonderful platform so that you can slowly start modernizing your applications as well, which means you can modernize your traditional virtualized applications into probably containers at a later point of time. So this is where the Azure Kubernetes Service, which is popularly known as AKS, So AKS is exactly what you see AKS in public Azure. So Microsoft literally brings the AKS, the true value of AKS into Azure Stack HCI. The same goodness of AKS is delivered onto Azure Stack HCI. So customers can really take advantage of modernizing their virtualized applications into containers using AKS on Azure Stack HCI. So, like I said, the traditional applications, which can be, Java-based applications or Microsoft technology-based applications. So it supports the entire application ecosystem in general. Now, like I talked about, for what's in it for IT engineers out there who are trying to manage the infrastructure, it really brings the best of both worlds. So, which means you have Windows Admin Center, which is a de facto tool or a standardized tool to manage the Azure Stack HCI clusters, and also Windows Server clusters, which we'll talk about. Or if customers are comfortable or have the Azure skill sets on-prem as well, they can continue to use their Azure skill set using Azure Arc. So we're going to talk about what Azure Arc in a separate episode later. But Azure Arc, it's a glue which kind of sticks your on-premises Azure Stack HCI resource, or it could be any on-premise infrastructure with public Azure. Okay, so think about it. Think about Azure Arc as a glue. So if customers are comfortable managing Azure Stack HCI infrastructure right from public Azure because they have the skill sets to manage, they can do that as well. So it really brings the best of both worlds. Now, if you look at some of the technical use cases, right? Who do we really go and target Azure Stack HCI for, right? So as you know, there are a number of 3-tier SAN deployment using Windows Server 2008, Windows Server 2012, and even Windows Server 2016, still on a legacy 3-tier SAN architecture, right? They're begging to be refreshed. So there's a great opportunity in the industry, because as the industry is trying to modernize their on-premise infrastructure to a more advanced hyperconverged infrastructure, HCI can be really a solid foundation for such customers who are really on the modernization of the infrastructure modernization journey. So, like I said, Azure Stack HCI is nothing new. It carries forward the same legacy which was there before as a trusted virtualization host. Even Azure Stack HCI is going to be a trusted virtualization host. Fast forward 6 years, we are in 2022 right now. So it is the trusted. So there is no customers or any organization really does not have to panic or be apprehensive that Azure Stack HCI is a new OS which is doing the virtualization. Not really. Given the current situation that we are all in the current COVID pandemic, every organization that I talk to wants to enable remote connectivity, which means they want to enable their employees so that they can remotely work from different locations or from the comfort of their home. So this is where VDI is really shining today. And the good news is, if you have customers today who are actually invested heavily on third-party VDI solutions, like for instance Citrix VDI and so on, Microsoft is also bringing the renowned AVD, formerly known as WVD, which is Windows Virtual Desktop. It's now called Azure Virtual Desktop, is now made available on Azure Stack HCI as well. So right now it's in public preview. In fact, at Dell we have also built a reference architecture, which I'm going to show in the reference the link at a later point of time. But it's a classical use case. So many customers today are trying to enable remote working. All right, so another use case to target is about robo and edge scenarios. Needless to say, I think I've talked about this why edge, right, in my first episode. IDC predicts that by about 2025, 75% of the total data growth is expected to be generated in the edge. right? So no wonder Edge is really the platform, Edge is really the location to go to. So there is a tremendous potential as because the Edge does not really need to have connectivity with public Azure. This is where you need that compute in the Edge locations to process the data then and there. Think about if you want to get real-time insights. Let's say, for example, if you have to process an image or a video inferencing, for instance, at that particular point of time, there is really no time for the data to come back to a centralized location or even public clouds and get that process there and then come back to the Edge location. There is not enough time to kind of do that, right? It has to be processed locally. So this is where Edge is very, very predominant in this space, and Microsoft with just 2 nodes, or even Microsoft recently announced that you can also deploy an Azure Stack HCI cluster with just a single node, right? So so you have organizations who are just ready to just deploy Azure Stack HCI cluster on a single node or just on a 2 node for their robo kind of or even Edge kind of scenarios. You have Azure Stack HCI have you covered there. This is very, very important. So you still have many organizations who are still running on SQL Server. When you talk about SQL Server, you obviously talk about performance. So you want to make sure that you deploy SQL Server, and not only are you just deploying SQL Server onto a new infrastructure, but it also needs to run from a performance standpoint even better. So I think Azure Stack HCI have you covered there as well, because Azure Stack HCI today is one of the most highly performant systems out there in the industry. In fact, Microsoft and Intel did some performance figures, which is just at 12 nodes, they were able to achieve close to about 13 million IOPS on Azure Stack HCI clusters. So these are like phenomenal numbers in terms of performance. So SQL Server is a sweet landing spot for Azure Stack HCI clusters. Now, as and when customers are slowly thinking about modernizing their on-premises and legacy applications to containers, you have tightly integrated AKS, which can run on Azure Stack HCI. All right, so let's jump right into the demo. Now, what you can see here is the Windows Admin Center. So Windows Admin Center, like I talked about, is a de facto tool to manage and monitor Azure Stack HCI clusters, even Windows Server clusters as well. So in a separate episode, I'm going to show how to deploy Azure Stack HCI operating system and then create a cluster and so on and so forth. But for this episode, I'm just going to show you the tool and what you can do with this tool and so on. So if you go to Windows Admin Center, so obviously you can do a number of things, which I obviously going to spend another episode exploring different options on how you can create a cluster and so on and so forth. But in this episode, let's look at the cluster that's already created. So as you can see, there's a server cluster that's that you can see here. So let's click on that cluster. And in the dashboard, as you can see, it shows me the status of this cluster. One important thing to note here, there is an Azure connection, okay? So which means it shows as connected, right? Very important to make a note here. So I'll show you how this is connected by logging into public Azure as well. But one of the prerequisites of Azure Stack HCI before it can be operated for day 1 to day n operation is that first prerequisite is it has to be registered against an Azure subscription using Azure Global Credentials. That is very, very important, without which the cluster will cease to run, right? One of the reasons why it has to be connected to public Azure, it works on a pay-as-you-go kind of a billing model, which means Microsoft is going to charge the customers $10 per core per month charged against their Azure subscription. Remember, Azure Stack HCI is an Azure service, so customers will have to pay for that service. So today it is charged at $10 per core per month, and which will be billed against a customer's Azure subscription, which they will register into. Now, If you go to the dashboard, you pretty much get the status and the health of the clusters in general. So let's take a look at the servers that are part of the cluster. So if I go into the summary, it says there are 4 total servers where they're clustered together. If I go to the inventory, say it shows, so these are like AX node 01. So AX nodes are the brand names for Dell Azure Stack HCI nodes, which are specifically meant for Azure Stack HCI. So as you can see, there are 4 nodes which are Dell AX740XT nodes. So there are 4 nodes which are clustered together, and they're and an Azure Stack HCI's cluster is created using these AX nodes. Now, like I said, it has to be registered against an Azure subscription. So what we have done is basically register this Azure Stack HCI cluster against this Azure subscription. So like I said, we will have a separate episode to talk about how to deploy Azure Stack HCI cluster and also register against an Azure subscription. So we'll spend a separate episode for that. So right now it is registered. So as you can see, I've registered using the name such as ASH cluster, and as you can see, this is the model is AX740. So if you just click on that, right? See, now Azure Stack HCI is actually, I logged into portal.azure.com and this cluster is showing up right here. So before I go in here, so let me just go into the home page of portal.azure.com. As you can see, Azure services, there are a number of Azure services. Now Azure Stack HCI, like I said, is also one of this Azure service. So now that's exactly what Microsoft terms it. So when Microsoft says Azure Stack HCI is an operating system which is delivered as an Azure service, they literally mean this as a service. So that's why you have Azure Stack HCI as one of the services here. So if I just click on that Azure Stack HCI, so there are a number of Azure Stack HCI clusters which are registered against this particular subscription. So what I'm interested is in this particular cluster which I have registered, which is the cluster made of 4 AX740XTs. So as you can see, the model is 740XT. So let me go into the cluster. Now, as you can see, I can see these nodes, right? These are AX node 01 to 04, and they tell me the model, the serial number, which is a service tag in this case. It shows me the number of cores each of these nodes have, the memory, the OS version, everything. All that details can be seen here. Not just that, I can tie any Azure construct to it, right? So for example, I can make use of Azure tagging. So I can simply go and tag these resources if I want to, right? I can do that as well. So if I go into, let's say, each particular node, it gives me more details about each of these nodes, right? As you can see, I've tagged each of these clusters with this Azure name. So for example, I'm sorry, I haven't tagged it, but if I want to, I can just go and tag these nodes as well. That I can do that as well, so that it becomes easier. So those who are familiar with Azure will, I'm sure, appreciate what tagging is. So with tagging, you're able to, you kind of filter out of hundreds and thousands of resources that you potentially may have deployed in Azure. It helps you do the filtering according to how you have tagged those resources. And you get pretty much all the Azure constructs. For example, the ability to do update management, the logs, the Azure monitor, Azure policies, all of that. So again, I don't want to spend time going into each of these things. We will look into a separate episode talking about each of these Azure HCI constructs and see how this is going to be of value add to customers. So going back again, so as you can see, there are a number of things that are coming into Azure Stack HCI as well. So if I go into Azure Stack HCI, go into the cluster again, right? Now, there are a number of things that are coming into Azure Stack HCI as new. For example, the ability to create virtual machines. This is right now in public preview. So the one that you are seeing here is you should be able to create a virtual machine or a self-service virtual machines which means you are actually creating a virtual machine into an Azure Stack HCI cluster, right? So what I've done is I've actually onboarded one of the Azure Stack HCI virtual machines. So if I go into Azure Arc, go into servers, okay. So there is a server which is called a Windows W2019 Arc VM. So this is a server that I've actually deployed on my Azure Stack HCI cluster. So let's say if I go into virtual machines, and so let's allow the page to come up. All right, so as you can see, there is a virtual machine that says W2019 Arc VM. So this is the same VM where I've surfaced that into public Azure using Azure Arc, and it treats this VM just like it treats an Azure virtual machine. So again, we will talk deeper into each of these conversations while while we have a separate episode for Azure Arc. But this is just to give you an idea about how Azure Stack HCI and public Azure are literally married together beautifully. So it's one single pane of glass. You can literally manage all of your Azure Stack HCI clusters, not just one cluster, but a number of clusters which are deployed in different locations, right from a single control plane using Azure. All right, so with that, I've come to the end of this presentation. So in this episode, we looked at what is Azure Stack HCI all about and why Azure Stack HCI as a product is so important to Microsoft and industry in general. We also looked at the legacy of Azure Stack HCI. Remember, Azure Stack HCI is not new. It carries a legacy behind using Windows Server Storage Spaces Direct. So, it is definitely not new. We saw why Azure Stack HCI is not a new product. It's actually just an evolution of WSSD. We also looked at what are the different industry approaches towards implementing Azure Stack HCI, like do-it-yourself infrastructure or validated node or integrated node kind of an approach. And not just that, we saw what really Azure Stack HCI all about. Why is it delivered as an Azure service, and what does it really mean, and what is it in it for the IT staff in an organization in terms of skilling, whether it's an Azure skilling or on-premises skilling and so on and so forth. And we also briefly compared between Windows Server and Azure Stack HCI. Like I said, we will have a separate episode talking about it. And also a very, very high-level overview of what Azure Stack HCI architecture is. Last but not the least, we also looked at some of the use cases for Azure Stack HCI, which is very, very important, and how customers can use Azure Stack HCI to target different use cases and different needs. And finally, we saw some Azure Stack HCI demo. So where I kind of had the opportunity to talk to you about how Azure Stack HCI is registered against an Azure subscription, what are the different Azure constructs that are exposed in Azure Stack HCI, since Azure Stack HCI is an Azure resource. So in my next episode, probably we're going to look at how to really deploy Azure Stack HCI clusters and then register against an Azure subscription and so on. Please leave your feedbacks, critiques and suggestions in the comment section. Until then, stay safe and stay tuned.